There was a time when she had a home, a job at the library, a life that made sense. But grief has a way of unraveling everything. After her husband passed, the medical bills piled up. Then came the foreclosure. One thing led to another, as it does. And suddenly she found herself without an address to call her own. She was 53 years old. The city looked different from the sidewalk. People walked past her now as if she were invisible. Sometimes that was a mercy. Sometimes it broke something inside her that hadn't quite healed. But Margaret kept her dignity. She kept herself clean as best she could. She found a spot near Riverside Park where she could sleep beneath an overpass, and she tried to remember what her mother used to say. Grace isn't about what happens to you. It's about who you choose to be when everything falls apart. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Margaret woke before dawn, folded her blanket carefully, and walked to the public restroom to wash her face. She had pale blonde hair that she kept pulled back, and kind blue eyes that still held traces of the woman she used to be. Her gray wool coat was worn but clean, and she wore it like armor against the judgment in people's eyes. She spent the morning sitting on a bench watching the world go by. Around 3 in the afternoon, she noticed smoke. At first, it was just a wisp curling from an apartment building across the street. But within seconds, black clouds billowed from a third-floor window. Margaret stood up, her heart beginning to race. People were gathering on the sidewalk, pointing and shouting. Someone was calling 911, and then she heard it. A child's cry, high and terrified, coming from inside. Margaret didn't think. She just moved. Her legs carried her across the street before her mind could catch up. The front door was unlocked, and she pushed through into the stairwell. Smoke was already filling the hallway, thick and choking. She pulled her coat over her mouth and climbed the stairs, following the sound of crying. 3rd floor. Apartment 312. The door was hot to the touch, but it opened. Inside, flames licked at the kitchen walls, and the smoke was so dense she could barely see. But there, huddled under a table in the living room, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with curly brown hair and wide, terrified eyes. "Come here, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice gentle despite the fear racing through her veins. "I've got you." The boy reached for her, and she scooped him up, pressing him against her chest. His small arms wrapped around her neck, and she turned back toward the door. The heat was intense now, and her lungs burned with every breath. But she kept moving, step by step, back through the hallway, down the stairs, toward the light. When they burst through the front door, the fresh air hit her like a blessing. She stumbled onto the grass and collapsed to her knees, still holding the child. People rushed toward them, firefighters, paramedics, neighbors. Someone took the boy from her arms gently, checking him over. He was crying but breathing. He was alive. Margaret sat there on the ground, coughing, her face streaked with soot and tears. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "You saved his life," the young woman said softly. "That was incredibly brave." Margaret just nodded. She couldn't find words. The firefighters put out the blaze quickly after that. The boy's mother had been at work when the fire started. A faulty wire in the kitchen, they said later. She arrived moments after, frantic and sobbing, and when she saw her son alive, she fell to her knees and wept. By the time the mother looked around to thank the woman who had saved her child, Margaret was gone. She had slipped away quietly, back to the shadows where invisible people belong. 3 days passed. Margaret tried not to think about the fire. She tried to go back to her routine, finding food, staying warm, surviving one day at a time. But something had shifted inside her. That little boy's face stayed with her, the weight of him in her arms, the precious fragility of life. She was sitting on her usual bench in the park when a black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore an expensive suit, the kind Margaret used to see on businessmen who came into the library. But his face held something unexpected, vulnerability. His eyes were searching, almost desperate. He walked directly toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you Margaret?" She looked up at him, startled. "How do you know my name?" He sat down on the bench beside her, not too close, respecting her space. "My name is David Harrison, that little boy you saved from the fire. He's my son, my nephew, actually, my sister's boy. Oliver." Margaret's breath caught. "Is he okay?" "He's perfect. Thanks to you." David's voice broke slightly. "You saved his life and then you disappeared. I've been looking for you for 3 days. I didn't need thanks," Margaret said quietly. "I know." David studied her face, and there was no pity in his eyes, only respect. "But I needed to find you anyway. To say thank you, yes. But also," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "also to ask if I could help you. If you'd let me." Margaret shook her head. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," David said firmly. "It's gratitude. You gave my family everything. Let me give you a chance." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I own a company. We have positions available. Nothing glamorous but honest work. And I have a studio apartment that's sitting empty. It's yours if you want it." Margaret stared at the card in her hand, not quite believing this was real. "I know. What people probably think when they see me," David continued softly. "Rich CEO, playing hero. But that's not what this is. My father. He struggled after my mother died. He lost everything. I watched him rebuild his life from nothing. I know how hard it is. I know how much courage it takes." He met her eyes. "You showed incredible courage saving Oliver. You deserve a chance to rebuild." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. "Why?" she whispered. "Because kindness matters," David said simply. "Because you matter. Because one person's compassion can change everything." Margaret moved into the apartment a week later. It was small but clean, with a window that overlooked the park. She stood in the empty living room and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having walls around her again. A door that locked. A bed. David had been true to his word. He offered her a position in his company's mailroom. The pay was modest, but it was steady. Her co-workers treated her with kindness, and slowly, carefully, Margaret began to remember who she used to be. More than that, she began to discover who she could become. She visited Oliver and his mother often. The little boy would run to her with open arms, calling her Miss Margaret, and every time her heart felt a little more whole. One evening, 6 months later, David stopped by her apartment with dinner, Chinese takeout, the good kind. They sat together at her small kitchen table, and he told her about his company's new community program. They were hiring people who'd experienced homelessness, offering training and support. "You inspired this," he said. "Your courage, your grace under impossible circumstances." Margaret smiled, and it reached her eyes. "I think we inspired each other." As David left that night, Margaret stood at her window and looked out at the city lights. She thought about all the ways a life can fall apart, and all the ways it can be rebuilt. She thought about how one moment of courage, one choice to help, can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. She thought about grace, not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that shows up when we choose kindness, even when the world has been unkind to us. The kind that says, "You matter. Your life has meaning. Your compassion can change the world." And in that quiet moment, standing in her little apartment with its view of the park, Margaret finally felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt home. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply show up for each other. One small act of courage, one moment of grace. That's where miracles begin.